The knock came just after 9, 3 hard raps swallowed almost immediately by a crack of thunder. And Luke Harrison set down the mug he'd been drying and looked at the door the way a man looks at a sound that doesn't belong to his life. Nobody visited the house on Larkspur Road after dark. Not in a storm like this one. Coming down in sheets so thick the porch light barely reached the steps, and certainly not a woman in a soaked charcoal coat, mascara running in 2 thin lines down a face he almost didn't recognize because he had only ever seen it composed, magazine still, 6 years younger. He opened the door, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Water dripped off her chin onto the welcome mat. Sophie had painted with lopsided sunflowers the summer before. The woman's hands were shaking, and not only from the cold. "You're Luke Harrison," she said. "Not a question. The man who pulled a woman out of a burning car on Route 9, 6 years ago. December." He didn't answer right away, because the memory of that night lived somewhere he didn't visit often. The smell of gasoline and scorched vinyl, a stranger's blood on his sleeve, headlights on their side in a ditch. "That was a long time ago," he finally said. "I need a husband," she said, "by Friday, or I lose everything my grandfather built. And you are the only person alive I trust enough to ask." Somewhere behind him, small feet padded onto the hallway floor, and Sophie's voice, half asleep, called out, "Dad? Who's at the door?" And the woman on the porch, billionaire, stranger, the ghost of a wreck he'd never spoken about to anyone, looked past his shoulder at the little girl in penguin pajamas, and something in her composed, ruined face cracked open like she was seeing a kind of light she'd forgotten existed. To find out how a carpenter from a 2-stoplight Colorado town ended up standing at the altar with one of the most powerful women in American business, and what it cost both of them to get there. Stay until the very end. If you've ever had a stranger's kindness come back around in a way you never expected, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. So many of you watching have lived some version of this story, and this community exists because you share it. There's something almost unbearable about the idea that the people who quietly hold a family together, a father working with his hands, showing up every day for a kid who needs him, are so often invisible to the very world that runs on people like them. While a company can spend a fortune chasing headlines and still forget who its foundation really was. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Madeline Brooks had never heard the name Luke Harrison. She was 34 years old and CEO of Brooks Dynamics, a company her grandfather Walter Brooks had built from a garage patent into a $12 billion aerospace and clean energy conglomerate, and on the particular December night that would end up rerouting both of their lives. She was driving alone on Route 9 outside a town called Ashford Falls after a board dinner that had gone badly, her mind more on quarterly projections than on the black ice forming on the 2-lane road ahead of her. She never saw the curve. The car went through the guardrail and down an embankment, and by the time it stopped rolling, the front end had folded around a tree and something under the hood had caught fire. Luke Harrison was 31 that winter, 3 years into raising Sophie alone after his wife Rachel died of an aggressive cancer that had taken 14 months to do what it did, and he was driving home from a late framing job when his headlights caught the broken guardrail and the orange flicker below it. He didn't think. He left his truck running with the door open, went down the embankment in the freezing dark, and pulled a stranger out of a car that was fully alight within 90 seconds of him getting her clear of it. He wrapped her in the flannel jacket off his own back, called it in, waited with her until the ambulance came, and when a sheriff's deputy asked for his name for the report, Luke gave it, shook the man's hand, and drove home to relieve the babysitter, because Sophie had school in the morning and rent was due Friday, and there was no version of that night, in his mind, that was about anything other than a woman needing help and him being the one who could give it. He never thought about her again, not because he was callous, but because that was simply the shape of the life he'd built. Quiet, forward-moving, no time spent looking backward at anything that couldn't put food on the table or get Sophie to soccer practice on time. He worked as a maintenance technician and part-time carpenter for a property management company in Ashford Falls, a job that used maybe a third of what he actually knew about structural engineering, mechanical systems, and load calculations. Knowledge left over from 6 years as a design engineer at a mid-sized firm in Denver before Rachel got sick. and everything about his life reorganized itself around her care. And, after, around Sophie. He kept his hands busy, he kept his voice low. He almost never mentioned that he used to design bridge retrofits and water treatment infrastructure for a living. Because the version of himself who did that had belonged to Rachel too. And some griefs are easier to carry if you don't take them out and look at them. Madeline Brooks, meanwhile, spent the 6 years after the accident building an empire on top of a debt she never got to repay. She'd been unconscious by the time she was pulled from the car and had woken up in a hospital in Grand Junction 3 days later, with second-degree burns on one arm, a fractured wrist, and no clear memory of the man who'd saved her. Only a name from a police report, a description too generic to be useful, and a flannel jacket that smelled of sawdust that she kept, unwashed, in a box in her closet for 6 years without ever quite admitting to herself why. She had tried twice to track him down. Both times the trail went cold at Luke Harrison. Ashford Falls, a common enough name in a town too small to appear on most maps. And both times she told herself she'd try again when she had more time, and both times the company ate the time instead. Walter Brooks died the spring Madeline turned 33, and it was only after the funeral that the family lawyer read the addendum to his will that nobody, including Madeline, had known existed, in order to retain voting control of Brooks Dynamics. The 61% stake that kept the company under family leadership rather than in the hands of the board members and cousins who'd been circling it for a decade. Madeline had to be legally married by her 35th birthday. If she wasn't, control of the company would pass automatically to a voting trust chaired by her cousin Preston Voss, a man who had spent the 18 months since Walter's death quietly courting the very board members who would decide the company's future, and who had made no secret, in private, of his plans to sell off the clean energy division, 11,000 jobs, to the highest bidder within a year of taking control. Walter had never explained the clause to anyone while he was alive. Madeline's private theory, one she never said aloud to another living soul, was that her grandfather, who had built Brooks Dynamics with his own wife at his side for 40 years, had watched his granddaughter turn into someone who worked 90-hour weeks and had not had a single serious relationship in a decade, and had tried, in the clumsy and controlling way of a man used to solving problems with leverage, to force her toward a kind of life he was afraid she'd never choose for herself. Whatever the reason, the deadline was real, the stakes were real, and by the time Madeline sat in her lawyer's office 3 weeks before her 35th birthday, listening to Preston Voss's people leak stories to the financial press about instability at the top of Brooks Dynamics, she had exactly one Friday left and no husband. She thought about the flannel jacket in the box in her closet before she thought about anyone on her own board, her own social circle, any of the dozen men who would have married her in an instant for the money and the headline. She thought about a stranger's hands, steady in freezing rain, telling her she was going to be fine in a voice that had made her believe it. She hired an investigator on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had an address on Larkspur Road in Ashford Falls, Colorado, a name, Luke Harrison, 37 now, widower, 1 daughter, and a single reckless, entirely un-CEO-like decision already forming in her chest before she'd even let herself examine it. She was going to drive there herself, in the middle of a storm, and ask a stranger to marry her by Friday. 8 months would pass before either of them would be able to say out loud what that knock on the door had actually set in motion. But on that particular rain-soaked night, standing on a Colorado porch with a little girl in penguin pajamas watching from the hallway, neither of them yet knew they were standing at the beginning of it. Luke didn't laugh, which surprised her. Most men, hearing "I need a husband by Friday" from a stranger on their doorstep, would have laughed, or shut the door, or assumed it was some kind of prank. Luke Harrison did none of those things. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the ruined mascara and the shaking hands and the very obvious fact that whatever this was, it was not a joke to the person saying it, and then he said, quietly, "You'd better come in out of the rain," and stepped aside. He made her tea she didn't drink and listened while she explained it. The will, the clause, Preston Voss, the 11,000 jobs, the deadline that was now 4 days away. Sitting across from her at a kitchen table with a chip in one corner where Sophie had dropped a cast iron pan 2 Christmases ago, And when Madeline finished, she opened a leather folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A proposed contract, drafted that afternoon by her legal team, offering him $4 million, full college funding for Sophie, and a Manhattan apartment, in exchange for a marriage that would last exactly as long as it needed to. 18 months. The minimum the will's language implied for the arrangement to hold up to scrutiny. After which they would quietly divorce and he would walk away with everything already promised, untouched. Luke looked at the paper without picking it up. "I appreciate you thinking of me," he said, "but I'm not for sale, and neither is my daughter's life." It was not the answer Madeline had planned for, and something about the flatness of his refusal, no negotiation, no counter, no flicker of the greed she'd built her entire pitch around anticipating, knocked the practiced CEO composure clean off her for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I'm not asking you to sell yourself," she said, and heard how hollow it sounded even as she said it. "I'm asking you to help me save something my grandfather spent his whole life building." "Then ask me like that," Luke said. "Don't put a number on it first." She left that night without an answer, soaked and humiliated in a way no boardroom had ever managed to humiliate her, and drove 2 hours back to Denver replaying the conversation with a rising, unfamiliar shame, because she had walked into a stranger's home and offered him money to solve a problem that was, underneath the legal architecture, actually about loneliness, about a will, written by a man who loved her and didn't know how to say so, except through control, about a company she was terrified of losing, not because of the money but because it was the only proof she had that she'd been worth something to the person who raised her. The real breaking point came the next morning, in a boardroom on the 41st floor of Brooks Tower, when Preston Voss stood up in front of the full board. 12 people, half of whom Madeline had known her entire life, and, with the polished, reasonable cruelty of a man who had spent a year building exactly this moment, suggested that given recent instability and the approaching deadline, the board consider appointing an interim voting trustee immediately, purely as a contingency, purely to protect shareholder value, while Madeline sorted out her personal affairs. He said it gently. He said it like a favor. 3 board members, who had known Madeline since she was a child, nodded along, and Madeline sat at the head of the table she'd inherited and understood, with total clarity, that she was one bad vote away from losing everything before Friday even arrived, and that the people voting against her would tell themselves, afterward, that they had done it out of concern. She did not cry in the boardroom. She waited until she was alone in the elevator, 41 floors down, and by the time the doors opened onto the lobby her face was composed again, because that was the only skill she had ever fully mastered. The disappearing of what she actually felt, in real time, in front of witnesses. If you've ever sat in a room and watched people you trusted decide, quietly and reasonably, that you were the problem, watch them call it concern instead of what it actually was, you already understand something about what Madeline was carrying into that Friday deadline. And if that's ever happened to you, we'd love for you to share it in the comments. This community has heard that story more times than you'd think, and every time, it matters. She went back to Larkspur Road that evening, this time without the folder, without the number, in jeans instead of the charcoal coat, and when Luke opened the door, she said only, "I was wrong to offer you money first. I should have told you the truth first, which is that I don't actually have anyone else to ask. And I am not asking you to marry a stranger. I'm asking the man who already saved my life once, 6 years ago, on a night nobody else stopped for, if he'd considered doing something almost as hard a second time." Behind him, Sophie had appeared again, this time fully awake, holding a half-finished model airplane, and she looked at Madeline with the unfiltered directness only an 8-year-old can manage and asked, "Are you the lady from the rain? Dad said you might come back." There was a debate some viewers will have already started forming an opinion about. Whether Luke should have said something, 6 years ago or 6 days ago, about who he really was before the world he'd walked away from, the engineer, the man who'd once designed the very kind of infrastructure Brooks Dynamics built, or whether staying quiet all those years was the only way he knew to protect a grieving little girl from a father who might have chased a career instead of chasing her school pickup line. It's the kind of question this story doesn't answer easily, and it's worth sitting with. Luke didn't say yes that night either. But he didn't say no. He asked her to come back the next morning, with real terms. Terms that had nothing to do with the number she'd offered, and everything to do with what an 18-month marriage, real enough to survive a board scrutiny, would actually require of both of them. And when the door closed behind her, Sophie tugged on his sleeve and asked, in the flat, world-changing way of children, "Are we gonna have a mom now?" A question Luke had no answer for, and one that would follow both of them into everything that came after. 6 days would pass before either of them said the word yes out loud, and neither of them yet knew that the hardest part of the arrangement wouldn't be convincing the board it was real. It would be figuring out, somewhere in the middle of pretending, that it already was. They were married on a Friday morning in a courthouse in Grand Junction, 17 minutes before the deadline the will demanded, with Sophie as the only witness besides the 2 lawyers required to be present, and Madeline wore a plain cream dress instead of anything from the closet full of gowns she owned. Because Luke had said, the night before, low and certain, "If we're doing this in front of my daughter, it's going to look like something worth remembering, not something we're getting away with." Preston Voss's people found out within the hour. By that afternoon, financial reporters had the story. CEO's surprise marriage to small-town widower saves Brooks family control. And the board, 12 people who 24 hours earlier had been drafting language for an interim trustee, went quiet in the specific way boards go quiet when a threat has been neutralized, and nobody wants to be the one who admits they'd already started celebrating its success. Madeline moved into the house on Larkspur Road. Luke's suggestion, not hers, on the grounds that Sophie's life shouldn't be uprooted for a story that was supposed to look, from the outside, like it had been built around family rather than around a boardroom. And it was there, in the small, unglamorous rhythms of a life she had never once lived, that something in Madeline Brooks began to come loose that 6 years of running a $12 billion company had never touched. She burned the first dinner she tried to cook. Sophie laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair, and Madeline, who had not been laughed at, gently, without malice, in longer than she could remember, found herself laughing too, standing in a kitchen with smoke curling off a pan, in a way that felt less like humiliation and more like belonging to something. She learned that Sophie liked her eggs scrambled soft and her sandwiches cut on the diagonal, that she was afraid of the dark but wouldn't admit it, that she still sometimes climbed into Luke's bed at 3 a.m., and he never once turned her away. She learned that Luke read to Sophie every night, without fail, that he'd built the bookshelf in her room himself out of reclaimed barn wood, that he never raised his voice, not once, not when Sophie broke a lamp, not when a contractor shorted him on a paycheck over the phone one evening, in a tone Madeline could hear from the next room. She had spent her whole adult life around powerful men who mistook volume for strength. She had never, until that house, met a man whose stillness was the strength. The evidence finder in this story wasn't a hidden document or a whistleblower. It was Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, who mentioned to Madeline at pickup one afternoon, entirely in passing, that Luke's name had come up years earlier in a professional engineering journal she happened to have read in college, attached to a bridge retrofit project outside Boulder that had at the time been credited to someone else entirely, a senior engineer named Gregory Whitfield, who had gone on to build a national reputation on the back of exactly that kind of high-profile public infrastructure work. Madeline said nothing to Luke that night. She stayed up until 2 in the morning at the kitchen table with her laptop instead, cross-referencing old project records, permit filings, and a design firm's internal newsletter from 8 years earlier that had, in one buried paragraph, actually named Luke Harrison as lead structural designer before a later issue quietly corrected the credit to Whitfield, with no explanation given. She confronted him with it gently the next evening, after Sophie was asleep, sliding the printed pages across the same kitchen table where he'd once slid a contract back at her. "You designed the Route 9 retrofit," she said. "The one that held during the flood 2 years later, when 3 other bridges in the county failed. That was you. And somebody else's name is on it." Luke was quiet for a long moment before he told her the rest, in the same flat, unadorned voice he used for everything that mattered most to him, that Whitfield had been his supervisor, that Whitfield had taken the final calculations off his desk 2 days before a client presentation, and put his own name on the cover sheet. That Luke had raised it once, quietly, to the firm's partners, and had been told, in language that sounded almost kind, that credit disputes weren't worth risking his job over. Not with a pregnant wife at home, who was, at that point, already 6 weeks into symptoms. Nobody yet understood were the first signs of the cancer that would kill her within 2 years. He'd let it go. He'd told himself it didn't matter, that the bridge stood, that the work was the point, not his name on it, and by the time Rachel got sick for real, he'd already stopped caring about a stolen credit line in a journal nobody outside the industry would ever read, because he had a wife who needed him and, soon after, a daughter who needed him more. "I didn't stay quiet because I was weak," he told her. "I stayed quiet because loud wasn't going to save her, and it wasn't going to raise Sophie. Some things you let go of on purpose." There's a version of this that some of you watching will see one way, and some of you will see completely differently. Whether staying silent in the face of a stolen career was quiet strength or a debt to himself he should have collected on sooner. Blue-collar competence versus a credentialed man's polish. Real work versus the name on the cover sheet. It's worth thinking about which side of that you land on. Madeline told him that night that she wanted to fix it publicly, formally, in a way that would put his name back where it belonged, and Luke told her, just as plainly, that he didn't want a headline. He wanted, if anything ever changed, for it to change because it was true, not because his wife was a billionaire calling in a favor. It was the first time either of them used the word wife, without a lawyer standing nearby to explain what it legally meant, and neither of them corrected it. The secondary crisis arrived 4 months into the marriage, in the form of a leaked internal memo. Preston Voss's fingerprints all over it, though never provable, suggesting to 3 major board members that the Harrison marriage was a documented sham arrangement designed purely to preserve voting control, complete with a private investigator's photographs of Luke and Madeline maintaining, per the memo's own clinical language, separate bedrooms and no observable public affection consistent with a genuine marital relationship. An emergency board session was called for the following month to review whether the marriage met the legal threshold the will required, and if it didn't, Preston Voss's trust would take control of Brooks' dynamics within the week, whether or not Madeline's actual feelings had by then become anything but fake. 1 month would pass before that board session, and neither of them yet knew that the hardest evidence they'd have to produce wouldn't be a document at all. The board session was scheduled for a Tuesday in the same 41st floor room where Preston Voss had first suggested, so reasonably, that Madeline needed a contingency plan. Luke had never once been inside Brooks' tower. He wore the only suit he owned, the one he'd worn to Rachel's funeral, and he stood at the back of the room while Madeline's legal team argued technicalities about the will's language, and he watched Preston Voss, polished, unhurried, wearing the same reasonable smile he'd worn a year earlier, present his private investigator's photographs to the board with the practiced calm of a man who believed he had already won. What broke the room open wasn't a lawyer. It was a structural engineer named Diane Petrosian, a board member Madeline barely knew, who happened to mention, during a lull in the proceedings, that Brooks Dynamicus Clean Energy Division was 6 weeks behind on a critical retrofit assessment for a wind turbine foundation site in Wyoming, a technical bottleneck that had already cost the company an estimated $11 million in delayed contracts and was, per the outside consulting firm Preston Voss himself had hired, projected to take another 2 months to resolve. Luke, without being asked, without raising his voice, said from the back of the room that the load calculations the consultants were using were built on an outdated soil-bearing model, that he'd worked the exact geology of that region on a project 8 years earlier, and that the fix wasn't 2 months of consulting fees. It was an afternoon with the right formula, and someone in the room willing to listen to a man in a funeral suit. Preston Voss laughed, once, dismissively, and Diane Petrosian, who had spent 30 years in structural engineering before she ever sat on a board, did not laugh. She asked Luke to walk her through it. He did. On a whiteboard someone rolled in the same quiet, unhurried voice he used to read Sophie her bedtime stories, naming the exact soil classification, the correct bearing capacity formula, the margin of error the consultants had missed. And by the time he finished, the room that had gathered to decide whether his marriage was a sham was instead staring at a whiteboard that had just solved an $11 million problem in under 20 minutes. It was Diane who said his name back to him with recognition in her voice. "Harrison," she said slowly. "You're not. You did the Route 9 retrofit. I sat on the review panel for that project 8 years ago. That was credited to Gregory Whitfield." She looked at Luke, then at the room. "Whitfield's firm has been a Brooks Dynamics contractor for 6 years. I need to know if that's the same man." It was, and the unraveling that followed happened faster than Preston Voss could manage. Within a week, the original firm's archived project files, the same ones Mrs. Alvarez had unknowingly pointed Madeline toward months earlier, surfaced under a formal records request, confirming what Luke had told Madeline at her kitchen table. His name on the original calculations, his signature on the internal design memos, a paper trail that had simply been overwritten rather than destroyed, the way most quiet injustices are. Gregory Whitfield, contacted by Brooks Dynamics' legal counsel for comment, resigned from his firm within 72 hours rather than face the review, and Preston Voss, whose entire case against Madeline's marriage had rested on painting Luke Harrison as a nobody who'd married his way into money, found himself instead explaining to an increasingly skeptical board why he'd spent a year building a case against a man who had just saved the company $11 million in an afternoon, using expertise he'd been quietly stripped of 8 years earlier and had never once tried to reclaim. Madeline watched all of it from a seat near the front of the room, and what she felt wasn't vindication on the company's behalf, though there was some of that. What she felt, watching her husband stand at a whiteboard in a funeral suit, unhurried, precise, entirely unmoved by 12 powerful people finally understanding who he was something closer to grief for every year those same rooms had spent overlooking men exactly like him, and something closer to love than she had let herself name out loud, not once. In the 4 months since she'd moved a single box of belongings into a house on Larkspur Road that had slowly, without either of them announcing it, become the only place she actually wanted to be. That night, back in Ashford Falls, after Sophie was asleep, Madeline found Luke on the back porch, and she didn't bring papers this time, and she didn't bring a folder. "I don't want an annulment in 18 months, she said. "I know that's not what we agreed to. I know I don't get to just decide that on my own." Luke was quiet for a long moment, the way he always was before he said something that mattered, and then he told her that he hadn't been thinking about 18 months in a long time either. Not since a burned dinner. Not since Sophie started calling her Maddie instead of the lady from the rain. Not since he'd started noticing, with something like fear, that he wanted her at that kitchen table every single evening, not because the contract said so, but because the house didn't feel finished without her in it. Preston Voss was not finished, though. The following morning, he requested an emergency shareholder vote of his own, invoking a clause buried in the company's founding charter that allowed a minimum quorum of shareholders to call for an independent audit of any material change in company leadership circumstances. Within 30 days of that change occurring, a last desperate maneuver aimed not at proving the marriage fake anymore, since that ship had sailed, but at forcing Madeline to answer, under oath, in front of the full shareholder body, exactly what her grandfather had intended by the clause in the first place, and what, if anything, it actually meant for a company built on family to be led by a woman whose family, until 4 months ago, had been exactly nobody at all. 3 weeks would pass before that vote, and neither of them yet knew it would be Sophie, not Madeline, who ended up saying the truest thing anyone said in that boardroom. The shareholder meeting was held in an auditorium on the ground floor of Brooks Tower, 300 seats filled with investors, employees, and a press pool larger than the company had drawn in a decade. And Preston Voss opened with a speech about legacy and stability that was, by any honest measure, well constructed, until he made the mistake of turning the floor over to questions, and a woman near the back stood up, identified herself as an engineer at the Wyoming site, and asked, simply, whether the board intended to formally reinstate Luke Harrison's name on the original Route 9 retrofit documentation, since half the room had by now read about it in the papers and wanted to know if the company that employed her actually stood for what it claimed to. Madeline answered that question herself, standing, unscripted, in front of 300 people and a dozen cameras. She told them the truth, not the version with a number attached, the version she'd learned to tell only after months in a house with a chipped kitchen table. She told them about a highway in December, a stranger who didn't hesitate. 6 years of carrying an unwashed jacket in a box because some debts don't disappear just because you don't repay them fast enough. She told them her grandfather had written a clause into his will that she'd resented for exactly as long as it had taken her to understand what he might have actually been trying to give her, which wasn't a company-saving contract at all. It was a chance to notice what she'd spent her whole adult life too busy to see. And she told them, in front of everyone, that the marriage they'd all read about as a legal maneuver had stopped being 1 month ago, that she loved her husband, that she was not interested in an annulment, an audit, or a vote about whether love that started as a contract was somehow worth less than love that started any other way. Preston Voss's motion for an independent audit failed by a wide margin. He resigned from the board within the month, quietly, without a statement, the way men who've been fully seen tend to leave rooms. The company offered Luke a formal position, Senior Director of Structural Integrity, a corner office, a salary with more zeros than he'd ever earned in a decade, a public ceremony to reinstate his name on the Route 9 project, with press in attendance. Luke turned down the office, and the ceremony both, the same quiet way he'd turned down the first contract on the kitchen table 8 months earlier. What he asked for instead was smaller and, to the board's visible confusion, cost the company almost nothing, a standing internal review process, permanent and independent of any single supervisor's authority, so that any engineer at Brooks Dynamics who believed their work had been credited to someone else would have somewhere real to take it. A door that hadn't existed for him 8 years earlier, built now so it would exist for the next person. Madeline named it, over his objection, the Harrison Review Board. He let that one go without much of a fight, mostly because Sophie thought it sounded, in her words, like something out of a superhero movie, and he'd stopped being able to say no to that particular argument some months back. The quiet coda came 4 months later, on an ordinary Saturday, not a wedding anniversary, not any date that meant anything to anyone but them. Madeline out on the back porch of the house on Larkspur Road, sleeves pushed up, sanding down a birdhouse Luke had started building with Sophie the week before, badly, cheerfully. Sawdust in her hair, in a way that would have been unthinkable to the woman who'd knocked on that door in a soaked charcoal coat less than a year earlier. Sophie sat between them, painting the birdhouse, a color she insisted on calling sunflower, the same shade as the mat by the front door. Luke came out with 3 mugs of tea nobody had asked for and sat down without saying much of anything, because by then the silence between the 3 of them had stopped being empty and started being full. "Do you ever miss it?" Madeline asked him once. The old life, the credit, the name on the cover sheet. Luke thought about it the way he thought about everything, unhurried, and told her that for a long time he'd believed the worst thing that ever happened to him was losing his name off a piece of paper, but he'd come to understand the actual worst thing would have been getting it back too late to notice a little girl growing up in front of him, or a woman standing soaked on his porch, and calling either of those things a distraction from the real work. If there's one thing this story asks of you, it's this: the people who hold the quiet weight in your life, a parent who never raised their voice, a coworker whose name never made it onto the cover sheet, anyone whose worth got mistaken for invisibility because they didn't shout about it. They are not overlooked because they have less to offer. They are overlooked because the rest of us are usually too busy to look. There was a jacket in a box for 6 years, unwashed, waiting for someone to notice what it actually meant. And there is probably something like that in your life too, something you've been carrying quietly, waiting for the right person to finally see it. If you believe quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen, and if this is the kind of story you want more of, we'd love to have you stay part of this with us. And if you want to know exactly what happened to the jacket Madeline kept all those years, stay a moment longer, because that's the final truth this story has been building toward all along. She still has it. It hangs now, cleaned and pressed, on a hook by the front door of a house on Larkspur Road, not as a relic of the night a stranger saved her life, but as a reminder every single day of the ordinary, unheadlined kind of person worth building a whole life around.